Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Rachel Morillo, and I am the DAJ Director of Public Engagement and Research here at the Institute of Contemporary Art. I am delighted to have here with us today Gloria Sutton, American artist, and Nancy Valladares to discuss the work of Carl Cheng on the occasion of the closing, sadly, of his show Nature Never Loses here at ICA. It's been such a journey, and so I've been so enamored with having Carl's work here in our galleries for the past few months, because in so many ways it materializes a sort of science fiction that I think is really essential to how I think about and navigate living right now. And here I mean science fiction more in the way, in Octavia Butler's configuration, which is as a method for looking ahead in such a way that is not about what our future will be, but how we think about it and foresee it. Carl is an exceptional artist who has been working at the juncture between fine art and industrial design for decades now, and oftentimes I hear his work described as prescient, and oftentimes what that means is that he was discussing climate change before the term existed, that he warned us of the dangers of human impact on the environment before the term Anthropocene was coined. But I think it also extends beyond that, in that we are seeing so many artists thinking through and utilizing and leveraging while simultaneously critiquing technology. His work posits that technology as a material process is not outside of nature and instead reframes the relationships between humans, the environment we inhabit, and the tools that we create. And that really will be the essential core of the conversation that you'll hear today. Despite all that I have just shared about Carl's work and its importance, Nature Never Loses marks the first in-depth museum survey dedicated to his innovative and genre-defying work. And that speaks to our mission as an institution, especially by way of working with artists that are, yes, emerging in some ways, but artists who have been here all along, who maybe have not had the attention that they deserve. And so I feel really lucky to be here and to be here at a time where we can host this work. Before I jump to introducing our speakers for today, I just want to say thank you to all of the folks who made this exhibition possible. This exhibition is the result of over 10 years of conversation between Carl and the curator, Alex Klein, and so we're extremely grateful to Alex, as well as the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, who gave major support for the exhibition, with additional support from the E. Rhodes and Lenora B. Carpenter Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Tiger Foundation. Substantial efforts were guided by Root Collaborative as part of Tiger Foundation's climate action pilot as well. We are always grateful to our board of advisors, as well as the individual supporters who make our programming happen. Special thanks goes to Philip Martin Gallery, the Art and Technology Lab at LACMA, Red Cat in Los Angeles as well, for their generous support in restoring and displaying Carl's work. And finally, to the curatorial fellows and assistants that made this work happen: Emily Lafer, Pell Tracy, Maya Buffett-Davis, and Markel Collins. So today you'll be hearing from Gloria Sutton, American artist, and Nancy Valladares, as I mentioned. The program will start with a brief reading by Gloria, which will then lead into a conversation between the three of them. And so I will go ahead and just read their bios now for you all who might not be familiar, but also for posterity. So Gloria Sutton is Associate Professor of Contemporary Art History and Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Northeastern University, a research affiliate in the Art, Culture, and Technology program at MIT. Sutton also serves on the advisory committee of the MIT List Visual Arts Center. In 2016, From 2016 to 2018, she collaborated with artist Renee Green on a series of interlinked public programs and exhibitions at Harvard University's Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts, culminating in the volume Renee Green, Pacing. Her scholarship has been supported by the Andy Warhol Foundation and the Getty Research Institute, where she is working on her current book, Pattern Recognition, Contemporary Art in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. American Artist makes thought experiments that mine the history of technology, race, and knowledge production, beginning with their legal name change in 2013. Their artwork primarily takes the form of sculpture, software, and video. Artist is a recipient of the 2024 New York Arcadia Award and a Trellis Art Fund grantee. They are a former resident of Smackmelon, Red Bull Arts Detroit, Abrams Art Center, Recess, I-Beam, Pioneer Works, and the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program. They have exhibited at the Guggenheim Museum, Whitney Museum of American Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Kunsthal Basel, Switzerland, and Namjoon Pak Art Center. American Artist is a former co-director of the School for Poetic Computation and a faculty member at Yale University. Last but not least, we have Nancy Valladares, who is an interdisciplinary artist, filmmaker, and educator from I always butcher this, Tegucigalpa, there we go, Honduras, currently based in New York. Her practice closely examines photography's historical entanglement with botanical imaginaries and chemical legacies. Nancy's work grapples with the networks and flows of image making and their accompanying technological regimes. Alongside artist Sheree, Nancy is a co-founder of lithologies.org, a decentralized research group interested in climate futures and new ecology imaginaries. Valladares was a resident of Triangle Arts Association and the Bauhaus Foundation, and received fellowships at Harvard University's Film Studies Center and Transmedia Storytelling Initiative at MIT. Nancy's work has been exhibited and screened at Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, the MIT List Visual Arts Center, and a few other galleries and museums. And I'll just leave it there, and I'll hand things off to Gloria, who will start things off. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Pop this up. And I have to say, one of the things I really appreciate is being in this network of artists, and so today's conversation really is meant to be a conversation. We'll open it up for Q&A as well, and field questions, and hopefully have a more of a dialogical approach to this afternoon as well. But I wanted to start out and maybe kind of set the tone a little bit, but just to echo Rachel's thanks, and also to Brittany, Lauren, Claudie here at the ICA, and also, again, shout out to Alex Klein, what you're seeing in the galleries today in the exhibition is a longer research project, and we're also working on an exhibition catalog that will be forthcoming as well later in the year. But I'm gonna just sort of kind of sketch out some themes, and I'll say, and points around Carl's work around the theme. Today we're talking a little bit about the lens of automation that Carl has really foregrounded for us. I'll say, and then we're gonna talk specifically, Nancy and American will present their own works and kind of touch on a few of these issues around the myth of automation as well. So Carl Cheng's artworks remain relevant and necessary regardless of the date they were created, because they never relied on technological novelty. Instead, Carl has been underscoring the scope and scale of technological acceleration's material impact and the myth of automation by pressuring the prevailing logic that the solution to technical problems requires more technology. His works counter the predominance of computational thinking, right? What we can think of as a convenient type of solutionism that suggests that any problem can be solved by a computer application. This type of app thinking, or this is a type of automation that drives the logic of computational systems and the stealthy integration of artificial intelligence into visual culture. And the best example that I can kind of give, or not best, but a kind of concrete example that I can give about what I mean about this stealthy idea of automation is around 2011 when Apple released the iPhone with this integrated software in which taking a picture immediately then ran it against kind of saturation, hue levels, even formatting, through social media to give you the most optimized, quote unquote, or popular approach to what your image should look like. So after 2011, image capture becomes synonymous or automated with image standardization, if that makes sense. And that's the kind of stealthy automation that I'm referring to. Instead, I think with Carl's work, especially now, as Rachel mentioned, those terms prescient and forward-thinking, but also embodied, visceral, eminently curious are ways that I would characterize his practice. And Carl's work is defined by his ethical precepts, which were kind of on display in these exhibitions that you see over the last 50 years and work produced. And viewed collectively, it makes a material argument that the rise of computation did not occur in isolation, but is deeply intertwined with the struggle for civil rights during the 1960s. Complexity, Carl reminds us, is not a condition to be reduced, but a lesson to intuit, countenancing the very human affordances of the human nature. And in doing so, he shows us how the myth of automation is built on the myth of full autonomy, the belief that machines will entirely replace human workers. In reality, so-called autonomous systems often rely heavily on human labor for support and maintenance, revealing the limitations of these technologies, as well as the extractive practices that have irreparable ecological consequences that I think both American artist and Nancy's critical work investigates in their own dynamic and diffuse ways. Here, in Nature Never Loses, Carl shows us how technological acceleration and a reliance on technically mediated labor has irrevocably transformed contemporary life, yet has failed to advance our comprehension of the ways we are complicit with the very social systems and economic structures that immiserate and continue to entrap us in an increasingly insular hierarchy. And this is where I think Carl's work is really important. It points to the trapdoor of our desire for automation, the assumption that automation affects all workers equally. Instead, the impact of automations are stratified, we know, along the lines of race, gender, and class, and disproportionately affect marginalized groups such as immigrants and people of color and women. A critical valence on Carl's artwork, and I would say, some of the kind of ideas around corporate anonymity and the critical send-up that both Nancy and artists have been really importantly interrogating, is by ascribing much of their public-facing works as John Doe Co. The artist disavowed the first rule of art making, use your own signature, use your own name. The conceptual move to operate under a corporate ID, which he did around 1966, registering for an official business license in 1970, was prompted by two fronts. First, creating these kinds of graphic interfaces and letterheads allowed the then UCLA art graduate student to call up Boeing and other places and request demo kits, information, and proprietary technology before it was publicly released. And also, it provided a cover of legitimacy for him in certain ways, right? By proxy, the generic moniker selected precisely for its placeholder for unidentified people, males specifically in US court systems and hospitals, and unmistakably those returning home from Vietnam in body bags. It offered him a way to both acknowledge and undercut issues of assimilation and appropriation that undergirded questions of racial representation in both the art being made during the 60s and 70s and the essentializing way that it often is historicized in the negative as monolithically non-Western, which still often occurs. The emergence of John Doe Co. coincided with other important feminist acts to critically frame issues of ecology, race, and technology. Signal examples here include Carl's fellow Los Angeles-based artist Judy Chicago adopting the city of her birth in 1970, as well as Valladares shedding the Austrian patriarchal lineage by taking the name of a brand of cigarettes to stamp her performance and expanded cinema works in all caps as Valley Export starting in 1967. Moreover, by taking on a collective corporate identity as the public-facing authorial tool, Carl Cheng, like Nancy Valladares, lithologies.org, critically use methods of collective research to investigate and reframe issues of land use, material reuse, genetic engineering, climate science, and food justice. Importantly, John Doe Co. helped dispel the notion that collaboration equaled collusion, a sentiment often applied to artists whose work relied on consumer electronics, municipal permits, the use of computer labs, dark rooms, or other academic resources and commercial fabricators. At the same time, corporations repurposing World War II technologies like weather radar, GPS, microwave ovens, and duct tape for a growing consumer middle class made strategic investments in the visual arts. And then I just giving you a couple of examples of thinking about famously experiments in art and technologies, Osaka Pavilion in 1970. And these corporations did this specifically to soften the legacy of their products as being origins or tools of war. So John Doe Co. underscores that art is always entangled in systems that it inhabits, and technology is never neutral. His practice also drew from the applied arts, as Rachel mentioned on the outset, including model building and fabrication techniques, after earning a fellowship from UCLA to study industrial design in the Folkwang Hochschule in Essen, Germany, whose pedagogy was influenced by Bauhaus ideas of merging craft and design and architecture, and also emphasizing ideas of sustainability and reuse. Carl's advanced these inherently interdisciplinary aesthetic vocabularies rather than engaging with the predominant discourse on pop and painting that emanated from his native Southern California during the 1960s and 70s. And arguably, this is one of the reasons why most of us has never heard of Carl Cheng's work, right? If you were already a double outlier working in Southern California and not making painting, there wasn't a kind of vehicle or a commercial context for your work to circulate outside of that. The expectation, if you were in that milieu or context, was that you'd adhere to those types of vocabularies. His frustration with the art world's business as usual status quo is evident in his art tool series that are on view upstairs on the second floor. Machines that automated the paint drips and pours central to mid-century abstract expressionism and color field painting. Produced in the UC Irvine wood workshop, so the University of California Irvine wood shop, where he took up a position as a lab technician after extended time studying and living throughout Indonesia and Japan. The mechanized elements allowed the same pattern to be repeated over and over. For Cheng's part, he has been consistently making visible the complex and often occluded interconnections between technological acceleration and extractive labor practices. And again, this is another connection that I see tacit, but maybe we'll talk explicitly between American artists in Nancy's work today. So thinking about the ways in which their works all collectively point to the very human fallout of our human-made disasters. So like in 1967, before the US government formed an EPA, or an Environmental Protection Agency, and the terms Anthropocene entered into the popular imagination, Cheng mounted his own early warning system, like those designed to detect impending hazards, with the idea that people would have the good sense to take the necessary precautions to mitigate damage. At the top, you see of this installation or this sculpture piece is a projected loop. And you see, when you look closely inside, images on a repeated loop around human-created disasters, ranging from oil spills to overflowing mounds of human waste, acting both as a beacon and a buoy warning of danger ahead. And I would say that, you know, this exhibition really is, what I love about this exhibition is that all of these things have been now restored. Curation equals conservation. So until this exhibition happened, a lot of this work wasn't extant in the way that you see in the galleries now. And I think that's an important point about curatorial practice. And it allowed Cheng to deepen his experiments in what he called indeterminate functionality. These erosion machines like the one that you're seeing here, where you can flip a switch and activate a UV blacklight while a PVC hose pressure washes rocks, accelerating geological processes of abrasion and attrition, all in a portable plug-in appliance that would look at home next to a microwave oven. And in supply and demand, he operates as a four-chamber biosphere, a kind of piece in which flies mature in an incubator and make their way through a tube to another quadrant. They transform into nutrients for these awaiting Venus flytraps. Emphasizing the transitory nature of life cycles, as well as the ravenous market dictum, eat or be eaten. His early investment in systems that juxtapose kinetic processes alongside organic, biological, and human social ones modeled an integrated system of transference, unfolding in real time. And I think there are connections with some of the methods, again, that Nancy and American use in their own research, rendering art less as a fixed object than an active agent, continuously operating on the viewer as well as the institutions and its publics, extending questions of agency into an ecologically derived politics kind of aimed at discerning the web of forces, and that's toxicity to discrimination that unevenly shaped live experience in equal measure with chemical pollutants. Finally, I would say Carl Cheng's ongoing, and again, he's alive and well, living and working in Santa Monica, continually to make work. His ongoing artistic practice is never dystopic. Instead, it helps us all to apprehend our own contradictory place in the world as both the progenitors and the exhausted casualties of our own codependency on the machines and technologies that are ushering in a new dark age of so-called automation, where culture seems to be, or already is, on the brink of unsustainability. However, by producing a diverse array of indelible and often irreverent artworks that underscore the complicity and complexity of our everyday actions, Carl Cheng's works do much to remind us that even though we can never fully opt out of automating systems, we don't always have to think like them. Thank you. So maybe at this point, both of you want to come up, or we can switch the slides to the rotating slides of their artworks? So we were going to loop on them. And I'll just preface my points with thinking about the relationship here between Carl's work and the work that they're going to share with us is not causal, right, but coincident. And arguably the reception around American artists and Nancy's work basically have created a context in which the excitement, rigor, and intellectual depth of their own practices is one of the very reasons why Carl's work is being recognized now, right? So I would say that it's this kind of reverse generative conversation around this. So I think that's first and really important to recognize, right? That the relationship that I'm teasing out or the connections that I made were not one-to-one or causal, but coincident. And really it's because of the depth of the rigor of their practices and the institutional embrace that they've had has made now someone like Carl's work visible where it wasn't seen before. So, you want to go ahead and... Maybe I feel like it's a little tight up there, but sure. I want to see the work. I'm being greedy.
Oh, right. Okay, sure.
Or you want to sit closer?
Yeah, I don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I just to reflect on some of the points you brought up when you were speaking. I mean, I think what stands out to me, first of all, obviously, is the John Doe Co. And I think part of why I was looped into this conversation was thinking about my own name change, and that in relationship to, like, you know, wondering how to fit into this sort of, like, you know, white Western model of like what an artist is, and in Carl Cheng's case, what a industrial, you know, fabrication company might be. And something I was thinking about is that him taking on that name doesn't change his identity, but rather the other way around. His identity changes the meaning of what that name is, which is the same thing that I thought about in changing my name to American Artist, challenging what our idea of that is and actually like forcibly redefining that word. And then something else I thought about, and in seeing the exhibition, how a lot of these objects resemble like prototypes for industrial tools that, you know, aren't necessarily functional in a practical way. Like they're not about like producing, I don't know, like products or anything. They're sort of, in some cases, mimicking nature or meant to create some sort of like experience for the viewer that's like intellectually or creatively stimulating. And just thinking about this notion of like a prototype or like that initial invention that may or may not become something more standardized. And I feel like in doing so, that's actually like directly contrasting to the notion of automation, because these objects don't necessarily become market objects or something. I mean, maybe, but like they're kind of like these one-off weird objects that he's making, which I also resonated with and sort of like saw a relationship to one of my earlier works, which is in here somewhere, that also used like UV light. It's like this blue, I don't know, it'll come up in a second. Yeah, and then, yeah, I'll leave it there. That's just my first kind of response.
I think that's one of the important points that you brought up, again, is this idea that what we talked about was like this notion of technologically mediated labor, right? The ways in which we differentiate. I think your work in particular has been really influential and important to my own thinking and research, where these tools are ones that are marketed or thought about as kind of accelerating or making life more efficient. And inherently, I know with your work, American, oftentimes there's a kind of liberatory tone through these kinds of technologically mediated tools, that they're supposed to liberate us, free us from the mundanity of labor and hard work to, you know, offer us more time for what? Unclear, right? But this idea of efficiency undergirding this fantasy of autonomous labor, in which a lot of your work really shows us the other side of it. And the term you sometimes connect that to is GUI, both playing on a graphical user interface, but also the kind of sludge, slow, quicksand way that we get sucked into things. Maybe another connection there. But I thought between both your work and Nancy's ideas and her research on alchemic processes, ones that are, again, you know, we think about as being efficient or a better way to make a print, or a faster, more consistent and more stable. Oftentimes your works, Nancy, show us media around photography and image making that isn't supposed to be fixed or stable, is inherently unstable. And maybe that's another connection between, or triangulate these kinds of ideas as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually really struck by that quote that I think it's in the exhibition. It's art is always entangled, technology is never neutral. And you know, one thing that I've been really thinking about in, you know, the past kind of few years has been about this idea of the images network, right? Images infrastructure. I think one of the things that I think Carl's work does, specifically when it addresses the image, is again very presciently talking about the moment in which we're living now, where like an image has taken a kind of computational turn, where we're not necessarily seeing the networks and the flows of data that make up an image. However, you know, those structures and the power relationships that they, you know, are a part of do have effects in daily life. And so I have an image here somewhere of Anthropocene landscapes, which is the large murals in the front of the exhibition when you enter. And I was kind of struck by this parallel between those like landscapes and the image of like the oldest surviving known example we have of a photograph by Nicephore Niepce, which I think is going to come up at some point.
And the really interesting thing is that that image was produced to technological, I would say, gave birth to two tools that I think are really, really important. One of them is photography, like the fixed image, the ability to fix an image onto a surface. And the second one is photolithography, which is a process that has been adapted to print microchips and in order to make the PCB boards and to make these kind of like smaller, faster, more efficient instruments. People use this technology that comes from a kind of a moment in photographic history, and now we're living in the moment where these two things have diverged and at the same time converged. And so this idea of the images network, art being entangled, technology never being neutral, I think is now more than ever important to discuss. I think this is like Anthropocene landscape, and then this is view from a window at Le Gras. And so I've been thinking about that a lot, and how Carl also uses, like, I guess in somewhat ways, geology, right, to tease out these ways of thinking about deep time, but also like a technological present. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think Americans' projects oftentimes run counter to this idea of time lapse too, this idea of what can actually be visaged or seen by the eye. Both of you look at processes that are about deep time in certain ways, right? Thinking about processes that don't necessarily lend themselves to the kind of running times of contemporary technologies in certain ways. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the durational or time element in some of the projects.
Yeah, I mean, well, before that, I wanted to respond to what you were saying about this sort of like challenging the assumption of automation, that it can be neutral or universal. And like through this, I have looked deeply at these sort of like early moments of computer technology design, and thinking about the way in which, you know, a lot of these, you know, cis straight white men in Silicon Valley were ideating what the future for everyone would look like, and making decisions as if they're neutral, you know, about how we might interface with the system, and modeling a lot of that neutrality off of like an office space. And there's a moment in the history of like, you know, personal computer design where you see this transition from the black background of a monitor to the white background. For anyone that's used like a computer from like the 70s or earlier, you would have a black screen as a sort of like neutral backdrop. And so I kind of latched onto that moment in time where there's this transition to whiteness as neutral in virtual space, as sort of a metaphor for the way whiteness has sort of like made a lot of the decisions around what is neutral within the space of computation. And so this work and also the work before this were part of this series sort of like exploring what it meant to challenge the assumptions around the functionality of computation, who it's prioritized, who it's sort of like intended to serve, and to what you were saying about the GUI, like GUI, graphical user interface, but also using that, you know, phonetic term of GUI to allude to this like I don't know, kind of gross, sticky, black sludge or something, as a way to think about how else computers could be or how they could function, something that's not shiny and new and constantly making a previous version obsolete, something that's slow, maybe it's broken, but it's still in use, just as a way to sort of like challenge the ideas around what we assume high technology should be or what it should do, and sort of break us out of this idea of technology that's been kind of imposed historically. And yeah, and to the point about time and sort of like weaving moments across time, I think a lot about how everything that we experience now and what we will experience in the future is an extrapolation of what's happened historically. And so in order to think about, you know, if we do want things to change, we have to recognize the patterns of how things have, you know, happened across time. Thinking about systemic racism as itself a sort of algorithm that's, you know, like foundational to the history of this country, and also plays out in our daily interactions and will sort of continue to unfold if unchecked, you know.
Yeah, well said. Nancy, you want to maybe comment or follow up
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
from your own works?
yeah, one of the things that I really kind of wanted to also address is this idea of labor in the production of kind of technologies and the production of images, which is something that I wonder if also Carl's training in the Folkwang in Germany, specifically in the region of Essen, had something to do with this. Essen is also like a well-known kind of coal mining town, or they have gigantic coal mining industry. There's like an enormous museum of coal, you know, where you can go, you can see the mines, and I think that that kind of geological movement and that awareness of that relationship to energy, to the extraction of fossil fuels from Earth in order to sustain kind of industry, I think, to me is present as a through line in the narrative of the work. And I also kind of spent some time in the Bauhaus in Germany, and I definitely feel that there's some echoes in what I saw from this historical research that we were doing there, and some of the things that kind of Carl is teasing out in this, well, I mean, over like an entire lifetime of practice. And one of them being, what's the relationship to energy, labor, and in my case, it was like image making. There is a film factory located in the Bitterfeld-Wolfen region. It's called the Agfa Orwar Film Factory. And I find that is a really interesting kind of case study of what the photographic industry and what a technology of image making can and cannot do. And that particular site is embroiled in a lot of like complex politics and environmental disaster. And one of the things that I think is really evident there is that people who were doing the labor and the work in the chemical factory, right, where the photochemicals were produced for the film industry for well over 100 years, I believe, or maybe like around 80 actually, closer to 80, left a scar on the site that is not going to be remediated, not until the next ice age. All the chemical pollution that was left behind by the photographic industry in that site is still there, and there is no paradigm for remediation. The only thing that people are able to do is contain this kind of chemical spillage, right? This it's a it's a kind of an example of how the things that we see on the surface of an image are they don't show, right, this other entire network of labor relations, of kind of chemical legacies, of material extraction that I think is really important when we talk about photography as medium, is that we cannot look at just the representation. We can't just look at even the history of photography and the way that it's been written without including the geological kind of history and the minerals that are used in order to produce those like images. And there's I think an entire new scholarship around the geology of the image. Like the work of Shaban Angus and I believe Esther Relfs and Bose Levin, who have written about like mining photography. And so I think this geological turn, is deeply entangled with also the computational turn that we're living in now, that I think it's important to make that connection.
And I would just pull back again and say one of the reasons why I'm so indebted to both of your practices and your work is because you both foreground that material, that insistence on a material history that oftentimes gets elided, because when we talk about digital or the turn or the idea of the computational turn, that this idea that it's somehow unembodied, that there's a kind of slippage there to kind of think about the efficiency of that somehow is more simple, less extractive, less, let's say, caustic, right, or toxic.
Yeah.
But in actuality, it still builds on those legacies
Yeah.
very much
Yeah.
so. And then I would just say maybe specifically in Nancy's projects that I got to see at the list with Fields Harrington, looking at some of the ways in which you were using sort of purposely using, like Carl, things that could be done by hand, by the sort of scale. Both of you work, I think, on a level that's a studio of 1 or 2, that it's the type of production that you both oftentimes do, but also in thinking about that particular piece in which you were able to distill down the chemical properties to the actual minerals of silver. But then I remember one of the points that comes up in the exhibition was like, but we can't really know what was actually in some of the celluloid and the chemical processes because they're proprietary. And like with American as well, a lot of the works that you point to in terms of the Silicon Valley software and the kind of ways in getting access to codes or algorithmic ideas are now protected by intellectual property and proprietary knowledge. I'm just wondering, between the two of you, thinking about that idea of what can be owned and authored, and how oftentimes your own works are pushing and pulling on those ideas of proprietary authorship.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was also just thinking about Carl Cheng's process, because yes, that stood out to me seeing the exhibition. That I don't really know his process, but it appears to me that a lot of these things were done on his own. And it's sort of ironic, like the individual artist making objects that appear manufactured, you know, by a company, compared to how many artists operate nowadays, where they have a factory producing artworks meant to look like an individual made it.
Absolutely, especially even painting.
Yeah, so that really stood out to me. Yeah, many of my works are made by me. Sometimes I'll work with someone, you know, if it's necessary, like the rocket piece that's in there. But yeah, I forgot what I was going to say after that.
But I just meant about the idea that one of the things I turned to both of you to is this idea that the kind of emphasis on proprietary, because you also both foreground this idea that research isn't something that it has to be authorized or invited, right? That oftentimes the way that you investigate certain processes in the works, you take on this approach in which we have a right to know, we have a right to that knowledge, we have a right to thinking about what is, you know, just because it might be patented or it might be proprietary doesn't mean that it's unknowable or you know, accessible. And so I think for me that's the kind of difference in both of your practices, where there's a kind of publicness to what you're doing, to put that on display, something that's often done in secrecy, that's sort of, you know, meant to be proprietary. You kind of create a public interface to bring that knowledge to the fore in a way that I find to be, when we look around now, like what are options for art to work and operate under today's oppressive conditions, I find that idea of research based not in the 90s, but the way that you're doing it now, which is to say it belongs to us, we can own it, we can use it, and we can show it.
Yeah, I think to your point, the way that a lot of these technology companies operate is on obfuscation. It sort of relies on obfuscation. Even the way that our relationship to computation has changed over time, things become increasingly inaccessible or unknowable. And, you know, I think a lot of the intentionality, or at least the way they frame it, is that, you know, this makes your life easier. You don't have to understand the intricacies of a computer to use one, but at the same time, you have sort of less access to control how it operates or understand what it's even doing, and then that allows a certain amount of, you know, your information to circulate in ways you don't control. So it's presented to us as something that makes our lives easier, but it's often extractive. And to your point, in both of our practices, we're directly investigating and challenging the ways that obfuscation is used in a lot of these technologies. And when you were talking about proprietary software, it made me think about the work that I made for the Guggenheim, which was, this surveillance system that was hanging in the museum and kind of like watching everyone. And it used these really like state-of-the-art cameras that I would not be able to access on my own. But because of, I'm working with the Guggenheim, they were able to request access to use this technology. And something that was really interesting was I was working with the media technologist expertise who works at the museum, who was really understanding the software and had the relationship to the company to speak with them about the cameras. But essentially, he had to be in the contract, to have access to these cameras. And we kind of joked about him being a material of the work because the work would not exist if he wasn't, the person who sort of interloping with the software company. And so to your point about proprietariness, that's as proprietary as it gets, where it's there needs to be a direct connection with one person within the institution who sort of represents the institution and essentially holds the access to that software.
Yeah, I think at the level of chemistry, I think in the photographic industry, I would say the biggest occlusion that I see, or at least historically we've seen, is where materials come from and how those materials are then configured chemically and then become photosensitive surface. And I think one of the moments that for me was really, really quite striking was when we heard from the film. It's a historical sort of collection that is located in the former site of this film factory in Bitterfeld-Wolfen, Germany, and they turned it into a museum and a chemical archive, so photochemical archive. And the museum director told us that they were able to trace where all of these materials come from. So for those of you who are photographers, you may be familiar with this, but black and white film is made up of layers of materials. There's a plastic layer, that holds the emulsion, and then there's gelatin and there's silver. You could say it's those three essential materials that can make up a photosensitive surface. And so he said that the cellulose, which is the plastic, was extracted from old growth forests in West Germany. The silver came from mines, also located in the western region. And the gelatin came from cattle bones that they were importing from India. And so that moment was sort of a gigantic paradigm shift for me in realizing there's an entire ecology behind every single one of these materials that is invisible in the labor of image making and image production. So the labor that happens in the darkroom requires an entire other system of labor before it even gets to the chemical batches, or before it gets mixed for the photographer to use. And so to me, this image here in particular is this recognizing that even as a 2D surface, an image still has geology and still has ecology, and it's important to talk about that, and its relationship to power, and who are the people who are mixing the chemistry, in these chemical factories and getting skin rashes and exposure, to kind of chemistries that leave lifelong effects and on themselves and their communities and their households. And those are things that have been occluded for a really, really long time in the historiography of image that I think is really important to talk about.
Right, and the idea of the technological image as being the clean image, or the pristine image. But maybe this is a good time to open it up a little bit if there's questions that we haven't touched on, or other questions. We have Nancy Valladares and American artists are here. It's a great opportunity to pose questions about their practice or any thoughts there too. So I can't see directly, but don't be shy if you want to wave your hand up or wait for a microphone to come to you. We have a one in the middle there. And while people are thinking, maybe I'll seed another question, which is bringing to the point the fallacy of obsolescence, right? So oftentimes one of the things that I learned a lot about in Carl's practice was this idea that he, this kind of reverse engineering around obsolescence or thinking about things being obsolete, and he has a term for them called human rocks. So if you see the idea of the fact that appliances now are cheaper because of fabrication and techniques, that it's cheaper to buy a new toaster or a microwave or a CPU right now than it is to repair one. And that's one of the things that he oftentimes will write or talk about and speak about, is this idea that these sort of state-of-the-art devices or apparatuses, as American alluded to, come with this mediated position where now even in the Internet of Things and smart refrigerators, everything is a computer, right? And so, in fact, oftentimes machines or appliances become unusable, not because they're obsolete, they're just no longer compatible with the operating systems that are currently up to date. They work, they're just not compatible. So, but maybe while people are thinking about some other questions, I wanted to pose the idea of obsolescence and the fallacy of obsolescence versus incompatibility, that both of you, I think, make very both poignant work around.
Yeah, I think a lot about, these Nokia brick phones from, I don't even know when those came out, that everyone loves.
You have to remind them, I teach
nostalgic.
undergraduates, so I always have to, do a little media archaeology at the start of the semester.
But it's interesting because, I think objects of that era, would still work if they weren't replaced. And so I think this idea of obsolescence is very much manufactured, and it's something where it's like we could build a relationship to our technology where we're meant to use it for 20 or 30 years, but then socially we've been subscribed into this ideology that things must turn over and be replaced, and it reflects the nature of capitalism and also how we treat people in society as well. It's all connected in that way. This idea that it's just easier to replace than it is to restore or repair also. And yeah, I think it is sort of a myth.
Yeah, I guess my thought was that there's also this idea that I've heard, float around for as long as I've had a relationship to photography, which is that photography is dead, and people don't want to talk about photo or
Oh yeah, the death of photography is only as popular as the death of painting.
Yeah,
but we know that to be false.
Yes,
right?
yes. I see. I mean, I'm. It's really interesting because I always see. So I'm an educator, and I always have students who are really curious about old photographic processes, and there's always this curiosity about what things used to be like, and this nostalgia for kind of previous formats of image and image making, image production, and interestingly enough, I feel like it's one of those things that just keeps coming back, and so I've had to rethink what is our relationship to image making technologies, because somehow, despite there being a 150-year-old history, right, for a lot of these processes, people are still playing with them, working with them, re-articulating them, and I think it's what is our relationship to these image objects now that we're faced with also our next crisis, which is the energy crisis, and what is the relationship between how do you, for example, maintain these giant data centers powered, right, where all of our images are stored. This idea of the cloud, as this thing that's up in the sky, we know to be a fallacy. The cloud is has kind of a physical presence. It has it exists in physical buildings, and so I think this idea of the image is as obsolete to me as yeah, it's taken on a new meaning. I don't think so at all. I think that there's a lot of ways that I think we should be engaging and critiquing our current practices of image making. And so I find that it's reanimated my practice. So I was trained as a photographer in undergrad, and so I do come from this traditional darkroom, training, and I stopped making images for a while because I was like, it doesn't make any sense. And there's been a kind of reanimation and rearticulation, at least for myself, a new interest, right, in this practice when you look at it at the molecular and chemical level. And so, yeah, there's something I think there that is interesting in terms of like media archaeology, but then also this gap that exists between the image object and then the technical image and then the computational image, the generative image right now, like we're in this new turn. So yeah, I think there's a slide there that says there's more images been made by AI up until now than has in the entire history of photography. And so I think something is happening there that I think we need to kind of grapple with.
Can I ask you something? Related to that last point, I'm curious how you feel or if you have any thoughts about the current relationship to image making, I guess particularly for a younger generation that's sort of like, digitally native, where you can kind of create images on your phone infinitely and you come across, so many images a day. I guess I'm just curious what you think about that relationship to imagery versus one that's rooted in like an analog or material production of images.
Yeah, we were like just talking about this like a couple of weeks ago with I think a colleague. So again, I go back to this idea of looking beneath the surface because while generative images, we can talk about what is this politic, right, of taking and scraping images that belong to other people in order to kind of create new models. There's this level which I think is important to grapple with.
Here you're probably just talking about synthetic or generative AI,
yes,
right?
Yes.
The way like Midjourney and other other programs do that work.
Yes, and when you kind of sink in beneath the level of that, generative, media relies on data infrastructures, and AI has actually become the new and the most recent, largest accumulations of wealth that we've seen in 20, maybe 30 years. There's only 3 or 4, I think, big AI companies, 3 of them in the US and 1 of them in China. Or is it the reverse? Maybe, I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's one of the largest land grab projects that we have seen in a really, really long time. And so structurally, and at the level of energy, right? Yeah, energy infrastructure, I think it has a really, really, really large footprint. And to me, it's like, how can you justify the environmental effects of that? It's really hard to do that. I think there's a certain level of incommensurability there that I think we need to talk about. So if we look again beneath the structure, beneath the surface, there's an entire structure there of power that I can't not think about. So,
and that's really important, I think, to kind of tie it back to some of the points that came up in Carl Cheng's work. For me, one of the things, as an art historian, I get asked a lot about to do, and a lot of artists oftentimes, like what you had just mentioned, will get caught up on the media archaeology, the novelty of seeing, I think, upstairs, some of the technologies that Carl was hacking and using, the ways in which we want to think about, we could read this entire show through a media archaeology of image production, but that would obscure what you got to right to the point with, Nancy, is that one of the reasons I have an ethical issue around media archaeology is that it often occludes the power dynamic that you just spoke about, right? It's much easier to talk about how we go from alchemic or chemical processes to digital processes and not actually talk about the labor and extractive conditions that enable something like that to exist or happen. And then likewise, the same way that we spend time when, if American Artist is talking about the Guggenheim and a kind of, let's say, corporate cultural cachet allows you access or entree to get equipment that might not be available on the consumer level to do a project. But one of the issues that comes up to my mind is the ways in which, because of this technological acceleration where we look at higher image refresh rates, more, in sort of intense technologies around imaging, that it obscures this idea that why and who are we taking pictures of, who's being surveyed, right? So, and it goes back to earlier issues around discrimination and representation, going back to the Shirley card of early photography, right? Which, photography was not calibrated for non-white skin, right? Video was not calibrated to register certain melanin colors, right? So the issue for me always is not to create apparatus or computers or mechanisms to capture or survey more people. It's to ask why are we doing it in the first place and for what, right? So it's less about facial recognition, refining it so it actually works on different colored skin, but actually asking why we rely on facial recognition right now and who's being surveyed, especially under today's conditions. So maybe I'll pause again and see through the lights if there are questions and comments. Rachel, I see, or if anybody has the microphone.
Yeah,
really
if you have a question, just pop your hand up and we'll come to you. If not, I have a question.
Sure.
'Cause this has been an amazing conversation and has given me so much to think about. I think as I'm processing Carl's show, and one thing that Nancy and I were talking about in the galleries is there's also so much humor in Carl's work that I think people often miss. And for me, it is him reaching for a kind of hope. And as much as I love thinking about all of these things, it gets to a point where all of these issues seem inescapable at this point. We're in this like very apocalyptic feeling moment. And I'm wondering for each of you actually where your curiosity currently lies, and like where are the moments, the glimmers that you're finding in terms of hope? Because I think, yeah, these are all such important questions, and I'm like, oh my God, and is death the answer? Like, where do we go?
Not death is the answer. That's bleak. Yeah, I don't know. I guess to be like, really straightforward about it for me, like I'm thinking about creating a more holistic relationship between my art, between my relationships with people, between how I understand art in relationship to other aspects of the world, not just within like the art industry bubble. And I think some methods of that are through like collaboration, or I don't know, finding ways for like my lived experience to like influence my art, how my relationship to the art industry influences my, working with people outside of the arts, just trying to sort of like pay attention to what's going on around me and find like, I guess, value in that, because I think, what's going on right now politically is really terrifying, and just trying to understand how I can sort of like build my community in a way that like supports me in a holistic way, because, things are getting dicey.
Well, recently, I think I've been actually making a lot with friends, and I've focused a lot of my energy in the recent kind of 2 years in working with my artist collectives, lithologies.org, and so we work across, like the world to make together, and oftentimes the making is not attached to any kind of like institution or necessarily tied to funding. It's kind of experimental, and it's small scale, and it's a response, I think, to the world around us. And so I've found that that has been, I've rebuilt a relationship to practice. And I had a talk recently with a class of students at Parsons who asked, it's like, well, how do you respond to the world around you? And I'm like, it's a really good question. I don't have an answer, but I will say one thing is that under the current administration, it's clear to me that they feel threatened by artists, by the humanities, by academics, scholars, and they hate artists. They hate the arts. That's enough of a reason to me to keep making, even if it's just to be spiteful, because in many ways, I think the space that art provides is, maybe art can't fix the world, but I think art can ask difficult questions. And art is a place where you can inhabit gray areas and sit with sticky and gooey things. And I think if it's so much of a threat to them, why not stick with it? Even if maybe it's not under the same conditions that we've seen under the neoliberal kind of project, and then this relationship to art as product and art as, commodity, right? I think we've maybe come to a point where that it's clear that needs to change. So I think more now than ever, this idea of staying with the trouble, I actually think is the thing that I'm very interested in.
That's amazing. I think a couple of lessons, great question, Rachel, too. And I think part of the lesson I take from, upstairs, there's an interview with Carl probably around 1985 or something, and he says something akin to, even in an apocalypse, nature survives, right? That the glitches, that there's always some type of, that you can't completely eradicate a certain will to survive. And I think that lesson that he articulates upstairs is something that I think about. I also think about the ways of gestures in this time where there's a lot of hyperbole around, artificial intelligence, the conditions here as being unparalleled, unprecedented, and really, something epistemologically new. No, we know very well how oppression works and how power works. This is not an epistemological shift. This is one of scale. And I think that's what constantly keeps me thinking about how to operate and thinking about the lessons of Carl's work is around what I think of as scalar alterity, right? These are not, we go from nano to big data, or we think about different ways of power dynamics. But these are questions of scale, not completely something different. And so there are different types of physical vector or scalar forces of degrees of force, of duration, of time, of power dynamics that we know to be physical and above all human. And I think that's one of the big lessons I take away is that and obviously just to echo what both of you are all saying is that finding a toehold for us to continue to make those kinds of human affordances that automation is trying to edit out is really the place for me that I think about how we can operate and continue to do the work that we want to see happen in the world. And not to be naive about it, right? These are all different positions of power, access, and privilege that we all occupy in different moments at different times. And when we have that here, and especially I want to, think about spaces like this where on a Sunday afternoon we can gather in a kind of dialogue, that's important. So thank you for everyone for being here too.
Thank you.
Yeah, but we have a question here too, or a point.
I think we've got a couple, so I'm going to
Great.
go there and I'll come back down here.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been great. Something I'm thinking about is the relationship between hardware and software. And what I love about this work is how, I mean, you mentioned he just makes this company and calls up other companies and they send him completely proprietary hardware that is then hacked in these amazing ways. And American, I'm thinking about your piece in the Guggenheim where you're sort of butting up against, you can have the hardware, but then you can't disentangle the software from the proprietary network. And I'm just curious about how you negotiated that with respect to what it's doing to the viewer and how we're sort of implicated in that. And then I'm also just curious, like, how secure or maybe not secure the Guggenheim's internal system was. Like, was that a concern? Like, at some point that the object that you're making could actually be accessed from an outside person, and then what's going on in the space is then suddenly, you know, a lot of it is pretty, not transparent, but as you know, like, our networks are a lot more, a lot less secure than we think they are. So I'm just curious if, like, that was a part of your thinking with the work as well.
Yeah, I mean, to the first part of your question, this notion of like software versus hardware, I think is something that's really contended in the space of high technology. And I think over time, it's become a more like discrete difference between what those two things represent. But essentially, hardware and software are like kind of the same thing. I mean, if you think about very early computation, where you had these room-sized computers that didn't have a screen or anything, and it was all just like circuits and switches. And essentially, that's what a circuit board is. It's just a bunch of, you know, binary computations that are happening. And so you can kind of think of software and hardware on like a spectrum. So that's, I mean, that's, I guess, like a epistemological question about, you know, what hardware and software means. But to the second part of your question, with the Guggenheim piece, we were not able to record any of the information, so everything was, you know, streaming live. There was a room where people would go and, like, you know, see what was happening or what was being seen by the camera. And the cameras themselves had computers inside of them that would do the AI deciding of who or what was human, which would be seen on the screen. But it wasn't, you know, sent to a computer to then do that computation. It actually happens within the camera itself. And yeah, I don't remember the company that produces the camera. I think it's one of these large technology companies. But that information wasn't saved anywhere. A lot of people asked me if I would like have access to it and check on it, but I did not have access to it. And I don't know, it was important for me that people could sort of like be on both sides of the equation, both being observed and then later witnessing, you know, other people and realizing that they had been observed. But it wasn't important to me that that information be like recorded or further dissected beyond that, even though the software could allow for very robust analysis and much more complicated mechanisms than anything we used for that installation. But yeah, I mean, I imagine someone from that company would be able to see that, but I don't think they actually could access that. So yeah, it was somewhat of a closed system.
And then maybe I'll just jump in and make a point about Carl Cheng's using of John Doe Co. It's, you know, it does sort of seem like a kind of performative gesture, but it was also one of his own kind of way, like I said, to kind of figure out and nuance a way to think about something around assimilation and appropriation at that time, when he often wrote about or spoke about the fact that his work was never sort of been able to be seen as, even though he's one of the few native Los Angelinos and grew up in the San Fernando Valley, he was never recognized as a Los Angeles artist because he didn't fit into the archetype, right, of what an LA artist looked like at that time. So there was another way in which, I just want to make sure that it, to think about the ways in which it was another way to kind of think about his own acts of assimilation and resistance to those ways of having to fit in at certain moments in art history. And in fact, the way that his first exhibition, that was like a 25-year survey, wrote about the work or kind of contextualized the work is, quite different than how this valence that Alex Klein and is organizing around conceptual art, land art, all these interventions into, contemporary art practices. But 25 years ago, it was written primarily around like Asian ideas of mandala painting and sand painting and other very heavily handed readings that were, biographically overlaid, which still happens. Mm-hmm. So was there another question maybe in the back? Yeah.
Hi. I have a couple of questions specifically for American artists. So I'm pivoting a little bit, and I wanted to refer to your exhibit at Pioneer Works, which is on Parable of the Sower. I ended up reading the book after I saw your show, and one thing I noticed about reading the novel, like spoiler alert, is that there isn't a lot of image-making practice in the book itself, even though there is art making in the form of the parable. And I'm wondering, because the book is meant as a satire as well as speculative fiction, if you think that that indicates something about Octavia Butler's criticism of visual culture when it comes to political survival, maybe, or maybe the place of art as it refers to political survival or just any sort of survival. And I think the other question I wanted to ask is, because you did make that show about her work, and her and Carl Cheng were contemporaries in a lot of ways. They're also both West Coasters. If working on that show gave you maybe some insights into Carl's work that maybe feel intersectional as well, and that an intersectional way that goes past just their ecological concerns. So yeah, I hope that that's concise enough, and thank you.
Yeah, no, those are both interesting questions. To your last question, I was also thinking about the fact that Carl Cheng was just like, I think 5 years older than Octavia Butler, and their work is dealing with the exact same issues, though in different ways. And I also grew up in Altadena, outside of Los Angeles, so having a similar perspective and kind of like thinking about the relationship to like sort of industrial science technology. There's a poster in the show for an exhibition that Carl had at Caltech, I believe. And so all of the sort of like institutional history around science and like military development in that area and how that relates to like science fiction history, that very much makes total sense. Like I could totally see Carl and Octavia Butler like, being on the same page, though I don't know if they ever interacted at all. And then to your first question, I wouldn't describe Parable of the Sower as a satire personally, but it is, somewhat hyperbolic, or so we hope. But but there is a lack of visuality, I would say. Like I agree with that part, if I'm understanding what you meant by that. And I think in Butler's work in general, a lot of it focuses on the sort of like emotional aspect of what the characters are experiencing, and there's less of a focus on these like, glossy images of new technology and like this super cool world. It really focuses on the human experience throughout these situations, and something that I wanted to do, because there are references in the book to specific things that they see on the news, for example, And Butler herself described herself as a news junkie. She would listen to the news all the time. She would study the newspaper religiously. I wanted to imagine visually what these news items they were seeing looked like. In my exhibition, there's a film that's, representing this news piece about this astronaut that dies on Mars, and so wanting to imagine what the characters were actually watching themselves. And then like the presidential ad campaign in the same way. And so, yeah, not wanting to focus so much on this like spectacular narrativization of the novel like you might see from like a Hollywood film, but more so what are the documents and artifacts that the characters themselves are witnessing, and what might they have looked like?
Or maybe just to relate to Nancy's work, maybe you could talk a little bit about the current project and research that you're doing now too, where I feel like part of, we live in such a, like what you mentioned, an image saturated moment, right? What are the kinds of ways in which you think about ideas about picturing, storing, and accessing that type of photographic image that's not just about representation, but also about datification a little bit, and thinking about the kind of material histories that you're looking at now would be helpful.
Yeah, sure.
I'm inspired by this work.
Thank you. The most recent, I guess, like kind of iteration of this work is dealing with. So, bitumen is one of the. It's sort of like a fossil fuel industry byproduct, and so the next iteration of this project, photosynthetic, which you guys, it's actually up on the screen right now, is kind of grappling with this turn, right, and this kind of split between the photographic production and this other kind of photolithographic process. And so I definitely think that I'm still making images, even if they're not representational necessarily. So I would say that while there's a kind of a certain level of refusal of representation, I think I'm still making a kind of image.
Mm-hmm.
And in relation to like storing and archiving and what it means to me these days, I feel, in light of recent events, I actually find myself having to rethink this kind of critique of the archive, and now how do we archive our kind of present moment and the things that are important, kind of crucial, especially when their memory is at stake. And so one of the things that I think I've been thinking about is like local networks, local servers, intranets, and alternative models to what we see today on the internet and what the kind of relationality is. And so I've been looking sort of at earlier ideas of the network, right, as kind of potential models. And so I don't know if you guys ever did this, but did you guys ever try a LAN party before? Like, connecting locally with each other. I think we're gonna have to look back at some of these, speaking of media archaeology, we may have to go back a little bit as maybe potential alternatives, and starting to keep your own cloud, like don't rely so much on these external infrastructures, and begin to rethink actually your own storage, but maybe more thoughtfully. What are the things that are important to us? Where can we keep them? How can we keep them safe? And how can we keep our community safe by giving them access to private networks? And so I think that there's something there that I think gives me, a little bit of hope. And I think sometimes it's okay to look back. Sometimes it's okay to look at history. It's not that you're trying to return or regress necessarily. It's just that the past always has lessons for the present. And so I find myself, looking back to previous, kind of iterations and ways of being.
Thank you, Nancy. So maybe we could say thank you to.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect note to end on. And so can we say thank you to our 3 speakers for today? Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rachel.
Nancy.
Yeah.
Thank you, American.